Picture this. A teenage girl gets kidnapped from her village, sold into slavery, and shipped off to what's essentially the world's most exclusive and deadly harem. Fast forward 20 years, and she's literally rewriting the laws of an empire that spans 3 continents. Oh, and she convinced the most powerful man on earth to break a 300-year-old tradition just to marry her. If that sounds like a Netflix series that got way too ambitious with its plot, well, welcome to the absolutely bonkers true story of Roxelana, the girl who went from Ukrainian peasant to Ottoman empress, and somehow made it look easy. If you're ready for a bedtime story that's equal parts Game of Thrones and The Bachelor, but with real consequences, you know what to do. Let's start with what we don't know, because honestly, it's almost everything. We don't know her real name. Roxelana was just what the Ottomans called her, basically meaning the Russian one, which is like calling someone Steve from accounting. We don't know exactly where she was born, though most historians point to somewhere in what's now western Ukraine. We don't even know what she looked like, beyond vague descriptions of red hair and fair skin that made her exotic in 16th century Istanbul. What we do know is this. Around 1520, when she was probably 15 or 16, her world ended in the most brutal way imaginable. Imagine you're a teenage girl in a small village. Your biggest worry is probably whether the harvest will be good this year, or maybe if that cute boy from the next village over will notice you at the market. You're not thinking about geopolitics. You're not considering that your little corner of the world sits right in the crosshairs of 3 massive empires, the Ottomans, the Poles, and the Russians, all of whom have very different ideas about who should control your homeland. Then, one day, the raiders come. These weren't random bandits looking for a quick score. This was organized, systematic, industrial-scale, human trafficking. The Ottoman Empire had turned slave raiding into a science, and the Crimean Tatars, their allies and vassals, were the undisputed masters of the craft. They would sweep through villages like a plague of locusts, taking anyone young and healthy enough to survive the journey to the slave markets of Istanbul. The young woman who would become Roxelana probably had about 5 minutes to process what was happening before her entire existence was reduced to a chain around her ankle and a price tag around her neck. One moment she's a free person with a family, a name, a future she could imagine. The next, she's property. The journey to Istanbul would have taken weeks, maybe months. Hundreds of captives chained together, marching through foreign lands, sleeping in the dirt, eating scraps. People died along the way, from disease, exhaustion, despair. The lucky ones, you might say, because what awaited the survivors was either back-breaking labor that would kill them slowly, or something that might have seemed worse at the time. Selection for the Ottoman imperial household. Here's where our story takes its first impossible turn. Because somehow, this nameless teenage girl from nowhere managed to catch the eye of talent scouts for the most exclusive institution in the Islamic world, the Sultan's harem. Now when you hear harem, your mind probably goes to some Orientalist fantasy involving silk cushions and women lounging around eating grapes. The reality was more like a cross between Hogwarts and a maximum security prison. The imperial harem was a sophisticated educational institution that trained women to be administrators, diplomats, and power brokers. It was also a place where one wrong move could get you strangled with a silk cord. Think of it as the world's deadliest finishing school. The selection process was ruthless. Ottoman officials were looking for girls who were not just beautiful, but intelligent, adaptable, and psychologically resilient enough to survive in an environment where your roommate might literally be plotting your murder. Out of thousands of captives, maybe a few dozen would make the cut, and somehow, our Ukrainian peasant girl was one of them. But here's what's really wild. Being chosen for the harem wasn't actually the worst thing that could happen to a slave in the Ottoman Empire. Weird as it sounds, it was actually a kind of opportunity, a terrifying, potentially lethal opportunity. But still, these women had a chance at real power. Some of them would become the mothers of future sultans. A few would become sultans' wives, and in extremely rare cases, one might become something unprecedented, a legal wife to the sultan himself. Of course, our girl didn't know any of this as she was processed into the harem system. All she knew was that she'd been torn from everything she'd ever known, and thrust into a world where survival meant reinventing herself completely. She had to learn a new language, a new religion, new customs, new ways of thinking. She had to become someone else entirely. And somehow, impossibly, she was about to become one of the most powerful women in history. But first, she had to survive her first night in the palace. In a place where women disappeared without explanation, where favoritism was measured in heartbeats, and where the wrong glance could be interpreted as treason, every moment was a test. She was about to enter a world where the currency wasn't gold or silver, but attention, the Sultan's attention. And in that economy she was about to become very, very rich. The girl who walked into Topkapi Palace that day had no name, no family, no past. But she had something else, an almost supernatural ability to read people, to adapt, to survive. She was about to need every bit of it. The imperial harem wasn't just a residence. It was an alternate universe with its own laws, its own economy, its own brutal social hierarchy. Imagine if you took a sorority house, gave it unlimited funding, added deadly political intrigue, and then locked everyone inside for life. That's basically what our Ukrainian teenager walked into. The palace complex was enormous. Over 700,000 square meters of courtyards, gardens, and labyrinthine buildings that housed somewhere between 800 and 1,200 women at any given time. Most of these women would never even meet the Sultan, let alone share his bed. They were servants, attendants, administrators, teachers, and guards in an institution that was essentially a small city devoted to one man's domestic life. The hierarchy was rigid and unforgiving. At the bottom were the Asami, new girls like our protagonist, who started as essentially unpaid interns in the world's most dangerous corporation. Above them were the Shakird, who had proven themselves worthy of basic training. Then came the Gedikli, the career professionals who ran the day-to-day operations. At the very top were the handful of women who had achieved the impossible. They had caught and held the Sultan's attention long enough to bear his children. But here's the thing that movies and books always get wrong. The Sultan didn't just wander around picking women like he was shopping for fruit. The harem had gatekeepers, and the most important one was the Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, who wielded more practical power than most kings. She controlled access to her son, and she took that responsibility very, very seriously. Think of her as the world's most terrifying HR director. For a new girl like our future Roxelana, the first challenge wasn't attracting the Sultan's attention, it was surviving long enough to get the chance to try. The mortality rate in the harem wasn't officially recorded, but considering that these women lived in close quarters in an age before antibiotics, with stress levels that would make a Wall Street trader weep, it was probably pretty grim. The training was intensive and comprehensive. New arrivals had to master Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. They studied music, poetry, dancing, embroidery, and calligraphy. They learned court etiquette so complex it made Versailles look casual. They were taught to read, to write, to do mathematics, and to understand the intricate web of alliances and enmities that governed palace life. But most importantly, they learned to navigate the social dynamics of a place where everyone was competing for the same prize. The attention of Sultan Suleiman, the Magnificent. And what a prize he was. Suleiman wasn't just powerful, he was arguably the most powerful man on earth. The Ottoman Empire in 1520 stretched from Hungary to Yemen, from Algeria to Iran. It controlled the eastern Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and most of the lucrative trade routes between Europe and Asia. European kings literally had nightmares about Ottoman armies showing up at their borders. Suleiman himself was in his mid-20s when our girl arrived at court, and by all accounts he was exactly the kind of man you'd expect to run half the world. Intelligent, charismatic, ruthlessly pragmatic, and probably exhaustingly intense to be around. He spoke multiple languages, composed poetry, and personally led military campaigns that redrew the map of Europe. He was also apparently devastatingly handsome in that way that absolute power tends to make everyone handsome. In other words, he was the ultimate alpha male in a world where being the ultimate alpha male actually meant something. The existing power structure in the harem reflected this reality. By the time our protagonist arrived, there was already an established pecking order. The current favorite was a woman named Gulbahar, who had given the Sultan his first son, Mustafa. In the Ottoman system, having a male child was like getting a golden ticket. It guaranteed your position and gave you serious political clout. But here's where the story gets interesting. The Ottoman Empire had a tradition called the law of fratricide, which sounds exactly as cheerful as it is. Basically, when a new sultan came to power, he was expected to execute all his brothers to prevent civil wars. This meant that every woman in the harem who had a son was potentially the mother of a future sultan, and potentially the mother of a future corpse. The competition wasn't just about love, or even lust. It was about survival, legacy, and the future of an empire. Every conversation was a negotiation. Every friendship was an alliance. Every rivalry was potentially deadly. Into this environment walked a teenage girl with red hair, no connections, no family to avenge her if she disappeared, and no particular reason to expect she'd live to see her 20th birthday. She couldn't rely on noble birth. She didn't have any. She couldn't rely on wealth. She was literally property. She couldn't rely on powerful relatives. They were probably dead or enslaved themselves. All she had was her wits, her adaptability, and apparently an almost supernatural understanding of human nature. What she was about to do with those advantages would shatter centuries of tradition and reshape the balance of power in one of history's greatest empires. But first she had to figure out how to get noticed without getting killed. The game was about to begin, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Here's what we know happened next, and honestly, it's so improbable that if someone put it in a movie, audiences would roll their eyes and demand a refund. Somehow, within months of arriving at the palace, this nameless Ukrainian peasant girl managed to not just catch Sultan Suleiman's attention, but to completely captivate him. We're talking about a man who had literally hundreds of women available to him, most of whom had been selected and trained specifically to be irresistible. These weren't just beautiful women. They were accomplished, educated, sophisticated women who had spent years learning how to please a sultan, and yet, somehow the new girl managed to outshine all of them. But how? The honest answer is that we don't really know. The palace records from this period are frustratingly vague about personal relationships, probably because writing down details about the Sultan's love life was a good way to end up decorating a spike somewhere. What we do know comes from later observers, diplomatic reports, and the evidence of what happened afterward. What seems clear is that whatever our future Roxelana did, it wasn't following the established playbook. The traditional approach to winning a sultan's favor was to be beautiful, demure, and accommodating. You were supposed to be like an exquisite piece of art, lovely to look at, pleasant to be around, and ultimately forgettable when the novelty wore off. Roxelana apparently took one look at this system and decided to flip it completely upside down. The few contemporary accounts we have suggest that she was witty, sharp-tongued, and absolutely unafraid to challenge the Sultan intellectually, in a world where women were expected to agree with everything a man said, especially if that man could have them executed for looking at him wrong. This was either brilliant or suicidal, possibly both. Think about the psychological profile this suggests. This girl had been torn from everything she'd ever known, enslaved, and thrust into a completely alien environment where one mistake could be fatal. And her response was to develop a sense of humor and start talking back to the most powerful man on earth. That's not just confidence, that's the kind of psychological resilience that probably should be studied by NASA for astronaut selection. The effect on Suleiman was apparently immediate and devastating. Here was a man who spent his days receiving reports from governors who ruled territories larger than most European kingdoms, negotiating with ambassadors from the world's great powers, and making decisions that affected millions of people. Everyone he met was either trying to please him, use him, or avoid being killed by him. And then there was this teenage girl who seemed completely unimpressed by any of it. It's like if you spent your whole life having people tell you you're amazing, and then you met someone who just shrugged and said, "Yeah, you're okay, I guess. Want to hear a joke?" The psychology of attraction is weird and unpredictable, but there's something particularly intoxicating about meeting someone who isn't trying to impress you, especially when you're used to literally everyone trying to impress you. Roxelana, whether by design or accident, managed to be the one person in Suleiman's life who treated him like a human being instead of a demigod. The other women in the harem must have been watching this development with a mixture of horror and fascination. Here was this nobody from nowhere, breaking every rule they'd been taught about how to survive in the palace, and somehow it was working. It would be like watching someone walk into a job interview wearing pajamas and somehow getting promoted to CEO. But Roxelana's success wasn't just about personality. She was also, by all accounts, genuinely intelligent in a way that complemented Suleiman's own intellectual interests. He was a patron of the arts, a poet himself, and someone who valued wit and creativity. While other women might perform songs or recite poetry for him, Roxelana apparently engaged him in actual conversations about literature, philosophy, and politics. Imagine the radical novelty of that for Suleiman. Every other relationship in his life was fundamentally hierarchical. Even his closest advisors were ultimately his servants. But with Roxelana, for maybe the first time in his adult life, he could have something approaching an equal exchange of ideas. Of course, it wasn't actually equal. He still held absolute power over her life and death. But within the artificial bubble of their relationship, she managed to create the illusion of equality. And that illusion was apparently addictive. The other crucial factor was timing. Sultan was young, he was at the height of his power, and he was probably starting to feel the weight of the isolation that comes with absolute authority. Everyone wanted something from him. Everyone was afraid of him. Everyone told him what they thought he wanted to hear. Roxelana offered him something different. Authenticity, or at least the appearance of it. In a world of calculated performances, she seemed genuine. Whether that genuineness was real, or just a more sophisticated kind of performance, is something we'll probably never know, but the effect was undeniable. Within months, she wasn't just another concubine in the harem. She had become Suleiman's favorite, his confidant, and increasingly, his partner in ways that went far beyond the bedroom. She was starting to influence policy, to mediate disputes, to act as an unofficial advisor on matters of state. And that's when things got really interesting. Because in the Ottoman system, there was no official role for what Roxelana was becoming. The Sultan's mother had political power, but the Sultan's women weren't supposed to. Concubines were supposed to be ornamental, not operational. Roxelana was about to change all of that. But first, she had to survive the backlash from everyone whose power she was threatening. And in the Ottoman court, that backlash could be swift, brutal, and final. The game was getting more dangerous, and the stakes were about to get much, much higher. By 5021, less than a year after arriving at the palace, Roxelana had achieved something that should have been impossible. She had become indispensable to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, not just as a lover, but as an advisor, confidant, and political partner. In a system designed to keep women powerless and interchangeable, she had somehow made herself irreplaceable, and that's when the real problem started. See, the Ottoman harem system wasn't just about the Sultan's personal pleasure. It was a carefully calibrated political machine, designed to prevent any one woman from accumulating too much power. The traditional model was simple. The Sultan would have children with multiple women, ensuring that no single mother could dominate the succession. When he got bored with one favorite, he'd move on to another. Everyone understood the rules. Everyone knew their place, and the system maintained its balance. Roxelana was systematically demolishing that entire framework. The first sign that something unprecedented was happening came when Sultan started staying. Traditionally, the Sultan would visit different women on a rotating basis, like a very high-stakes dating app. But increasingly, he was spending his time exclusively with Roxelana. Other women in the harem found themselves decorating the furniture while the Sultan conducted what was essentially a monogamous relationship in the middle of his polygamous household. This wasn't just romantic favoritism. It was a political earthquake. Every other woman in the harem was seeing her chances of advancement, of motherhood, of relevance, slowly evaporate, and in a place where your entire identity and future depended on the Sultan's attention. That was an existential threat. The existing power structure began to mobilize against her. Gulbahar, who had previously been the most favored concubine and mother of the heir apparent, Prince Mustafa, found herself increasingly marginalized. Imagine being the presumed future queen mother, and watching some upstart teenage peasant slowly usurp your entire life plan. The resentment must have been volcanic. But here's where Roxelana's strategic genius really becomes apparent. Instead of trying to destroy her rivals directly, she made herself so valuable to Sultan that attacking her became tantamount to attacking him. She didn't just win his heart, she became essential to his reign. How did she do this? By becoming his intellectual partner in a way that went far beyond anything the harem system was designed to accommodate. While other women competed to be the most beautiful or the most talented at traditional feminine accomplishments, Roxelana made herself useful in ways that were traditionally reserved for male advisors. She studied the empire's politics with the intensity of a graduate student. She learned about the various provinces, their governors, their problems, their potential. She began offering insights on policy, mediating disputes between officials, and gradually inserting herself into the actual business of running the empire. Think about how radical this was. The Ottoman Empire was a Muslim state in the 16th century, operating under religious and cultural traditions that severely limited women's public roles. The idea of a woman, especially a former Christian slave, having significant political influence, would have been scandalous enough to trigger riots in Constantinople. But Suleiman was apparently so infatuated, and Roxelana so skillful in her approach, that he began treating her as a de facto co-ruler. Not officially, of course, that would have been impossible, but in practice she was becoming one of his most trusted advisors on matters that affected the entire empire. The other crucial element of her strategy was understanding the long game. While her rivals were focused on immediate gains, getting pregnant, securing gifts, winning temporary favor, Roxelana was building a foundation for permanent power. She wasn't just trying to be the Sultan's favorite, she was positioning herself to be the mother of his successor. In 1521, she gave birth to her first son, Mehmed. This wasn't just a personal triumph, it was a political nuclear weapon. In the Ottoman system, sons meant everything. They were your insurance policy, your claim to future power, your guarantee of relevance, long after your beauty faded. But Roxelana didn't stop there. Over the next few years, she would have 4 more children with Suleiman, another son, Selim, and 3 daughters. This wasn't just impressive fertility, it was a masterclass in political strategy. Each child represented another bond, tying her to the Sultan, another reason for him to consider her welfare when making decisions about the succession. The mathematics of this were brutal for her competitors. Traditional Ottoman practice was for each woman to have 1 son, preventing any single mother from dominating the line of succession. But Roxelana was accumulating multiple potential heirs while simultaneously monopolizing the Sultan's attention. She was rewriting the rules of the game while playing it. The backlash from the traditional power structure was swift and vicious. Palace intrigue turned deadly as various factions tried to find ways to eliminate this unprecedented threat. Poison, accidents, and mysterious illnesses were all standard tools of harem politics. Roxelana had to navigate an environment where her morning coffee might literally be her last. But here's what's truly remarkable. Instead of being intimidated by these threats, she seemed to thrive on them. If anything, the danger appeared to sharpen her political instincts and deepen her bond with Suleiman. She was learning to think like an empress while everyone around her was still treating her like an upstart concubine. The old system was breaking down, and Roxelana was the earthquake causing the damage. But the real shock was still coming, because what she had accomplished so far, becoming the Sultan's exclusive favorite and the mother of multiple heirs, was just the foundation for something completely unprecedented in Ottoman history. She was about to attempt something that no woman had ever achieved. She was going to marry the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and somehow, impossibly, she was going to succeed. Sometime around 1533 or 1534, the exact date is lost to history, probably deliberately. Something happened that shattered 300 years of Ottoman tradition. Sultan Suleiman, the Magnificent, ruler of an empire that stretched across 3 continents, married his slave concubine, not in some private ceremony that could be conveniently forgotten later, but in an official, legally binding marriage that made her his wife and empress. To understand how absolutely revolutionary this was, you need to understand what Suleiman was giving up. For 3 centuries, Ottoman saloons had not married anyone. They had concubines, they had favorites, they had baby mothers, but they did not have wives. This wasn't just tradition, it was considered essential to the stability of the empire. The logic was brutally practical. Wives have legal rights that concubines don't. Wives can't be discarded when they become inconvenient. Wives have claims on inheritance and succession that are much harder to ignore. Most dangerously, wives have families who might expect to share in their elevated status, creating new power centers that could challenge the Sultan's authority. The entire Ottoman system was designed around the Sultan being unencumbered by permanent romantic commitments. He was supposed to be married to the empire, not to any individual woman. Suleiman threw all of that away for a former slave girl from Ukraine. Think about the political earthquake this represented. Every major decision in the Ottoman Empire was made by consensus among the Sultan's advisors, the Grand Vizier, the military commanders, the religious authorities, the senior bureaucrats. These men had built their careers, understanding and working within established systems, and now their boss was telling them that he was rewriting the fundamental rules of imperial succession, because he was in love. The immediate reaction from the political establishment was probably unprintable. Imagine being a senior advisor who had spent decades mastering the intricacies of Ottoman court politics, only to discover that your emperor was making decisions based on his feelings. It would be like finding out that the CEO of your company was restructuring the entire corporation because his girlfriend asked him to. But here's what makes this story so fascinating. Somehow, Suleiman made it work. Not just politically, but practically. Roxelana didn't become a liability to his reign. She became an asset. Instead of weakening his position, their marriage somehow strengthened it. How is this possible? How do you take a decision that every expert thinks is catastrophically stupid and turn it into a political masterstroke? The answer lies in understanding what Roxelana brought to the partnership. She wasn't just a pretty face who had gotten lucky. She was a genuinely gifted political strategist who understood the empire's challenges in ways that complemented Suleiman's own expertise. While he was focused on military campaigns and grand strategy, she was building networks, gathering intelligence, and managing the domestic politics that kept the empire running day to day. Think of it as the ultimate power couple, but with actual power over millions of people. The marriage also sent a clear message to the empire about Suleiman's priorities and intentions. By elevating a former slave to the position of empress, he was demonstrating that merit and ability mattered more than birth or background. In an empire that relied heavily on the talents of converted slaves and merit-based advancement, this was actually a politically savvy move. It also solved a practical problem that had been building for years. What to do with Roxelana's growing political influence? As a concubine, her power was technically informal, and therefore unstable. As a wife, her authority had legal backing that made her position much more secure. Instead of having to constantly maneuver for influence, she could now exercise it directly. The marriage ceremony itself was probably a carefully orchestrated affair designed to maximize political benefit while minimizing backlash. Unfortunately, the details have been lost to history, either because the records were destroyed or because the whole thing was kept deliberately low-key to avoid inflaming opposition. What we do know is that the marriage was recognized by both civil and religious authorities, making it legally binding under both Ottoman law and Islamic law. This wasn't some symbolic gesture or private arrangement. It was a full legal marriage that gave Roxelana all the rights and privileges of an Ottoman empress. The immediate consequences were dramatic. Overnight, Roxelana went from being a powerful concubine who could theoretically be disposed of at any time, to being the Sultan's legal partner with constitutional rights and protections. Her children went from being potential heirs to being legitimate princes and princesses with formal claims to the succession. More importantly, she now had the legal authority to act on Suleiman's behalf in certain circumstances. She could issue orders, make appointments, and conduct diplomatic negotiations with the full weight of imperial authority behind her. She had become, in effect, a co-ruler of the Ottoman Empire. The old guard of Ottoman politics must have been watching this development with a mixture of horror and fascination. Everything they thought they knew about how the empire worked was being rewritten in real time. The careful balance of power that had kept the system stable for centuries was being reorganized around one woman's influence over the Sultan. But here's the thing that makes this story even more remarkable. It worked. Instead of descending into chaos or civil war, the empire continued to function smoothly. If anything, it seemed to function better. Suleiman's reign during this period was marked by military victories, economic prosperity, and cultural achievements that earned him the title Magnificent. Whatever Roxelana was doing behind the scenes, it was working. But her greatest triumph, and her most dangerous gamble, was still to come, because being married to the Sultan was just the beginning of her ambitions. She was about to attempt something even more audacious. She was going to engineer the succession of her son to the Ottoman throne, and that meant eliminating the competition. All of being married to Suleiman was a triumph, but Roxelana understood something that her enemies didn't. In the Ottoman Empire, real power wasn't about being the Sultan's wife. It was about being the Sultan's mother, and that meant ensuring that one of her sons would inherit the throne. The problem was Prince Mustafa. Mustafa was Suleiman's eldest son, born to Gulbahar before Roxelana had even arrived at court. By traditional Ottoman succession laws, he was the presumptive heir. He was also, by all accounts, everything you'd want in a future sultan. Intelligent, capable, charismatic, and popular with both the military and the people. If the succession followed its normal course, Mustafa would become sultan, Gulbahar would become the all-powerful Valide Sultan, Queen Mother, and Roxelana's children would become potential threats to be eliminated. In other words, The traditional succession would likely mean death for Roxelana's entire family. So Roxelana did what any rational person in her position would do. She set out to destroy Prince Mustafa's career, reputation, and ultimately his life. And she did it so skillfully that she managed to convince Sultan to execute his own eldest son. Let that sink in for a moment. A former slave convinced the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire to murder his most qualified heir, clearing the path for her own children. If that's not the most successful long-term strategic planning in human history, it's certainly in the top 5. The campaign against Mustafa was a masterpiece of psychological warfare that unfolded over more than a decade. Roxelana didn't make the amateur mistake of directly attacking him. That would have been too obvious and probably would have backfired. Instead, she systematically undermined the foundations of his support while gradually poisoning Suleiman's mind against him. The genius was in the subtlety. Rather than making direct accusations, she planted seeds of doubt. She would mention, casually, how popular Mustafa was becoming with the Janissaries, the elite military corps that had a history of deposing sultans they didn't like. She would express concern about certain governors who seemed overly eager to curry favor with the prince. She would wonder aloud whether Mustafa's growing confidence might be turning into dangerous ambition. None of this was technically treason, or even criticism. It was just a concerned stepmother sharing her worries with her husband. But the cumulative effect was to make Suleiman increasingly paranoid about his eldest son's loyalty and intentions. The historical record is frustratingly vague about the details of this campaign, probably because the people who witnessed it were smart enough not to document a sitting empress methodically orchestrating the destruction of the heir apparent. But the broad outlines are clear from the results. Over the course of the 1530s and 1540s, Mustafa's relationship with his father deteriorated from close collaboration to mutual suspicion to outright hostility. Roxelana also worked to elevate her own sons in Suleiman's estimation. She made sure they were well-educated, politically sophisticated, and visible in court life. She arranged for them to receive important administrative appointments that would give them experience and credibility. Most importantly, she made sure Suleiman saw them as capable alternatives to Mustafa. The psychological dynamics of this family drama must have been incredible to witness. Imagine being Suleiman, trying to navigate between his love for his wife, his paternal feelings toward all his children, and his responsibility to choose the best successor for the empire. Every family dinner would have been a minefield of subtext and hidden agendas. Meanwhile, Mustafa himself seems to have been largely oblivious to what was happening until it was too late. He continued to serve his father loyally, leading military campaigns and governing provinces effectively, but his very competence was being used against him. Every success was reframed as evidence of dangerous ambition, every display of leadership as potential disloyalty. The turning point came in 5053, during Suleiman's campaign against the Safavid Empire in Persia. Mustafa was serving as a provincial governor in Anatolia when reports reached the Sultan, suggesting that his son was planning a rebellion. These reports were almost certainly fabricated or exaggerated, but they provided the justification Suleiman needed to act on the suspicions that had been building for years. Suleiman summoned Mustafa to his military camp, ostensibly for a routine conference about the campaign. When Mustafa arrived, he was immediately seized by mute executioners and strangled with a silk bowstring, the traditional method for executing members of the Ottoman royal family. The execution sent shockwaves throughout the empire. Mustafa had been widely regarded as the most capable of Suleiman's sons, and his death was seen as both a tragedy and a strategic disaster. The Janissaries, who had particularly favored Mustafa, were reportedly so outraged that they came close to mutiny. Several high-ranking officials resigned in protest, but from Roxelana's perspective, it was a complete victory. With Mustafa eliminated, the succession was now wide open for her own children. Her eldest son, Mehmed, was now the presumptive heir. Even if something happened to him, she had a backup in her second son, Selim. The execution of Mustafa was probably the most controversial decision of Suleiman's entire reign. Later historians would debate whether it was justified, whether Mustafa was actually planning a rebellion, whether Suleiman was manipulated by his wife, or acting on his own suspicions. But from a pure power politics perspective, it represented the complete triumph of Roxelana's long-term strategy. She had started as a nameless slave with no resources except her intelligence and determination. 20 years later, she had eliminated the primary obstacle to her family's control of the Ottoman throne. She had literally rewritten the succession of one of history's great empires. But empires are unpredictable things, and sometimes the universe has a sense of irony about human ambitions. Roxelana's victory was about to become incomplete in the most tragic way possible. Just when Roxelana thought she had secured everything, the Sultan's love, legal marriage, elimination of the primary rival to her children, and clear path to dynastic control, the universe decided to remind her that even empresses are not immune to heartbreak. In 1543, her eldest son Mehmed died suddenly at the age of 22. The historical records are deliberately vague about the cause of death, which in Ottoman court terminology usually meant either poison or mysterious circumstances that it would be unhealthy to investigate too closely. What we do know is that Mehmed's death was unexpected, devastating to both his parents, and politically catastrophic for Roxelana's long-term plans. Mehmed hadn't just been her firstborn, he had been her masterpiece. She had spent over 2 decades grooming him to be Sultan, ensuring he received the best education, the most important administrative appointments, and the kind of political experience that would make him an effective ruler, unlike his half-brother Mustafa, who had developed his credentials through military service. Mehmed was being positioned as the intellectual heir to Suleiman's legacy. He was also, by most accounts, genuinely impressive. Contemporary sources describe him as intelligent, capable and popular, everything you'd want in a future sultan. His death wasn't just a personal tragedy for Roxelana, it was a strategic disaster that threatened to unravel everything she had worked to achieve. The psychological impact on both parents was reportedly severe. Suleiman, who had already been struggling with guilt over Mustafa's execution, now had to confront the possibility that he had murdered his most capable son to make way for another son who was now dead. The irony was brutal. He had destroyed his succession plan to protect a child who couldn't be protected. For Roxelana, Mehmed's death must have felt like cosmic punishment for her role in Mustafa's execution. She had played the Game of Thrones as ruthlessly as anyone in history, and she had won, but winning had cost her the very thing she was trying to protect, her son's future. The grief seems to have fundamentally changed both of them. Suleiman became increasingly religious and melancholy, spending more time on spiritual matters and less on the active governance that had made him magnificent. Roxelana, meanwhile, threw herself into charitable works and architectural projects with an intensity that suggested someone trying to atone for past actions. But even in grief, Roxelana remained a political strategist. With Mehmed gone, the succession now fell to her second son, Selim. And Selim was, well, let's just say he wasn't Mehmed. Where Mehmed had been brilliant and charismatic, Selim was adequate and unremarkable. Where Mehmed had shown natural leadership abilities, Selim seemed more interested in pleasure than power. Where Mehmed had been universally respected, Selim was generally tolerated. If you had to design the least inspiring possible heir to one of history's great empires, you might come up with someone like Selim. This created a new set of challenges for Roxelana. It's one thing to promote a genuinely qualified candidate over his rivals. It's another thing entirely to try to position a mediocre son as the best choice to rule half the world. She was going to need every bit of her political skill to make this work. The first challenge was Suleiman himself. Having lost his 2 most capable sons, Mustafa to execution and Mehmed to death, he was increasingly reluctant to finalize the succession at all. There were persistent rumors that he was considering breaking with tradition entirely and ruling indefinitely, or even naming a completely different successor from outside his immediate family. Roxelana had to navigate the delicate task of promoting Selim without making his limitations too obvious. She arranged for him to receive important but not too challenging administrative appointments. She made sure he was visible at court without putting him in situations where his shortcomings would be exposed. She essentially managed his political career the way a modern publicist might manage a celebrity's image. Lots of positive exposure, careful management of public appearances, and strategic avoidance of situations that might reveal inconvenient truths. The second challenge was the broader Ottoman establishment, which was becoming increasingly concerned about the empire's future leadership. Many officials who had reluctantly accepted Mustafa's execution because they believed Mehmed would be an adequate replacement were now facing the prospect of Emperor Selim, and they weren't thrilled about it. Roxelana had to rebuild her political coalition around a much less attractive candidate. This required calling in favors, making new promises, and essentially convincing the Ottoman elite that Selim's limitations could be managed through strong advisors and institutional support. The third challenge was time. Suleiman was aging, And with each passing year, the succession question became more urgent. Roxelana was also getting older, and her influence depended heavily on her personal relationship with the Sultan. If Sultan died before the succession was secured, she could find herself in an extremely vulnerable position. But perhaps the most difficult challenge was emotional. Mehmed's death had forced Roxelana to confront the ultimate limitations of even the most successful political maneuvering. She had achieved everything a woman could achieve in the Ottoman system: marriage to the Sultan, elimination of rivals, control over the succession, and it still hadn't been enough to protect her child. The grief and guilt from this period seemed to have motivated her increasing focus on charitable works and religious foundations. She began funding hospitals, schools, and mosques throughout the empire, creating a legacy that would outlast her political machinations. It was as if she was trying to balance the scales of karma after years of ruthless political calculation. But even in her grief and guilt, Roxelana never lost sight of her ultimate goal: securing the throne for her surviving son. Selim might not have been the heir she had originally planned for, but he was the heir she had left, and she was going to make sure he inherited an empire, even if it killed her. Which, as it turned out, it very nearly did. By the 1550s, Roxelana was facing the most precarious position of her entire career. Sultan was in his 60s, showing signs of age and illness that made the succession question increasingly urgent. Her preferred heir was dead, her surviving son was underwhelming, and a new generation of court officials was beginning to question whether the empire really needed to be ruled by someone whose primary qualification was having the right mother. But if there's one thing we've learnt about Roxelana, it's that she was never more dangerous than when she was cornered. Her final campaign to secure Selim's succession was a masterclass in political strategy that combined everything she had learned over 3 decades at the pinnacle of Ottoman power. She couldn't rely on Selim's natural abilities. He didn't have any that were particularly impressive. She couldn't rely on popular support. He wasn't particularly popular. She couldn't even rely on Selim's paternal favoritism. By most accounts, the Sultan was increasingly ambivalent about all his surviving children. What she could rely on was her own reputation, her network of allies, and her understanding of how power really worked in the Ottoman system. The key insight was this: in an empire as vast and complex as the Ottomans, the Sultan's personal qualities mattered less than the system's stability. What the empire needed wasn't necessarily the most brilliant ruler, but a ruler who could maintain continuity and avoid civil war. And continuity meant accepting the established line of succession, even if that succession led to a less than ideal candidate. Roxelana began systematically building the case that Selim represented stability while any alternative represented dangerous uncertainty. She reminded key officials of the chaos that had followed disputed successions in other empires. She pointed out that Selim, whatever his limitations, had been raised in the palace, educated in Ottoman traditions, and was completely committed to maintaining the existing system. Most importantly, she made it clear that she would continue to be available as an advisor and stabilizing influence during Selim's reign. The subtext was obvious: you're not just getting Selim as Sultan, you're getting the continued involvement of the most politically astute woman in the empire's history. This was a subtle but crucial shift in her political strategy. Instead of trying to prove that Selim was the best possible Sultan, she was arguing that he was the safest possible Sultan. In an empire that had grown wealthy and powerful through careful, conservative management, safety was actually a compelling selling point. She also worked to eliminate any remaining alternatives. There were still distant members of the imperial family who could theoretically be considered for the succession, and Roxelana made sure they either died in convenient accidents or were appointed to distant provinces where they couldn't build political support. The campaign required extraordinary political skill, because it had to be conducted entirely behind the scenes. Roxelana couldn't openly lobby for her son's succession. That would have been inappropriate and potentially counterproductive. Instead, she had to influence the influencers, building consensus among the people who would ultimately advise Suleiman on the succession question. She cultivated relationships with the Grand Vizier, the military commanders, the religious authorities, and the senior bureaucrats who actually ran the empire day to day. She made sure they understood that supporting Selim meant continuing their existing relationships and maintaining their current positions, while opposing him meant uncertainty about their futures. The genius of this approach was that it aligned her family's interests with the institutional interests of the Ottoman establishment. Everyone had reasons to want stability and continuity, and Selim, despite his limitations, represented both. But Roxelana's most important ally in this final campaign was time itself, and specifically, the growing evidence that Suleiman was running out of it. By the late 1550s, the Sultan was clearly aging. His health was declining, his energy was diminished, and he was spending increasing amounts of time dealing with chronic pain and illness. This created a sense of urgency around the succession question that worked in Selim's favor. When you're facing the immediate prospect of a leadership transition, the appeal of a safe, predictable candidate increases dramatically. Nobody wanted to risk a civil war or a disputed succession, especially with the empire facing challenges on multiple fronts. Roxelana also understood that Suleiman himself was becoming increasingly concerned about his legacy. He had spent 4 decades building one of history's great empires, and he wanted to ensure that it survived his death intact. That meant choosing a successor who would maintain stability, even if that successor wasn't particularly inspiring. In this context, Selim's very mediocrity became a kind of qualification. He wasn't brilliant enough to completely reorganize the empire, but he also wasn't incompetent enough to destroy it. He was, in modern corporate terms, a safe hire for a senior management position. The final piece of Roxelana's strategy was ensuring that Selim would have strong institutional support once he became Sultan. She worked to position capable advisors who could compensate for his limitations, while maintaining loyalty to her family. She also made sure that the key military and administrative positions were held by people who had reasons to want Selim's reign to succeed. By 5058, the succession question was essentially settled, even though Suleiman was still alive and technically still making the decision. Through a combination of political maneuvering, alliance building, and sheer persistence, Roxelana had managed to secure the throne for her son, despite his obvious limitations. But she wouldn't live to see her ultimate victory. In April 1558, after nearly 4 decades at the center of Ottoman power, Roxelana died. The cause was probably natural. She was in her 50s, which was a respectable age in the 16th century, but the timing was poetic. She had accomplished everything she had set out to do, and she died knowing that her son would inherit an empire. The girl who had arrived at the Ottoman court as a nameless slave was buried as an empress, and her tomb became a site of pilgrimage for women throughout the empire, who saw her as proof that intelligence and determination could overcome any disadvantage. Her final gambit had succeeded. Now, it remained to be seen whether Selim could actually rule the empire she had won for him. Roxelana died in April 1558, but her influence over the Ottoman Empire was just beginning. The systems she had built, the precedents she had established, and the son she had positioned for power would reshape the empire for generations. Sometimes the most important consequences of a life aren't visible until long after that life has ended. Suleiman's grief at her death was reportedly profound and public in a way that was unusual for Ottoman sultans. He had lost not just his wife, but his closest advisor, his intellectual partner, and probably the only person in the empire who could speak to him as an equal. The last 8 years of his reign, from Roxelana's death until his own death in 1566, were marked by increasing isolation and melancholy. But the political machine Roxelana had built continued to function even without her direct control. The network of allies she had cultivated, the institutional arrangements she had established, and the precedents she had set all worked to ensure that Selim would inherit the throne smoothly when Suleiman finally died. And inherit he did. In 1566, Selim II became Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Exactly as his mother had planned, the transition was remarkably peaceful, with none of the civil wars or succession disputes that had plagued other empires when capable heirs were passed over in favor of less qualified candidates. Of course, Roxana's critics would argue that this smooth transition came at a terrible cost. Selim II was exactly as mediocre as everyone had expected. His reign was marked by military defeats, administrative incompetence, and the beginning of what historians would later call the Ottoman decline. The empire that Suleiman had made magnificent began its long, slow slide toward irrelevance under his less capable successor. But here's where the story gets complicated. Was Selim's mediocrity really Roxelana's fault, or was it an inevitable consequence of the impossible situation she had been placed in? Think about it from her perspective. She was a woman in a system that gave women no official political power. She was a former slave in a society that valued noble birth. She was a foreigner in an empire that prized Ottoman traditions. Every advantage she gained had to be won through intelligence, adaptability, and sheer force of personality. Given those constraints, what were her realistic options? She could have accepted her fate as a powerless concubine, in which case her children would have been vulnerable to elimination whenever political circumstances changed. She could have tried to work within the traditional system, supporting the natural heir even though that heir's success would have meant her family's destruction. Or she could have done exactly what she did, systematically dismantled the existing power structure and rebuilt it around her own family's interests. Was this selfish? Absolutely. Was it ruthless? Certainly. But was it also the rational response of an intelligent person trying to protect her children in an extremely dangerous environment? That's harder to argue against. The real tragedy of Roxelana's story might be that she succeeded too well. Her political skills were so extraordinary that she managed to place a fundamentally unqualified person on the throne of a great empire. If Selim had been even moderately competent, Roxelana's legacy would be unambiguously positive. Instead, she's remembered as the woman who engineered the beginning of Ottoman decline. But consider the alternative history where she had failed. If Mustafa had become Sultan instead of being executed, would the empire have fared better? Possibly, but we'll never know. What we do know is that Mustafa's supporters would have almost certainly eliminated Roxelana's children as potential threats, continuing the cycle of violence that had characterized Ottoman succession for centuries. From this perspective, Roxelana's actions looked less like selfish ambition and more like desperate self-defense. She was trapped in a system that gave her only two choices: destroy her enemies or be destroyed by them. She chose survival, and she was extraordinarily good at it. The broader historical impact of her life extends far beyond the specific question of who inherited Suleiman's throne. Roxelana fundamentally changed what was possible for women in the Ottoman Empire. Before her, the Sultan's women were expected to be beautiful, submissive, and ultimately forgettable. After her, they were political players in their own right. The period following Roxelana's death saw an unprecedented era of female political influence in the Ottoman Empire, often called the Sultanate of Women. For nearly a century, the empire was effectively ruled by a series of powerful women, sultans' mothers and wives who wielded authority that would have been unthinkable before Roxelana's example. These women used their power to fund charitable works, commission architectural projects, and influence policy in ways that had lasting positive effects on Ottoman society. The hospitals, schools, and mosques built by Roxelana and her successors provided essential services to ordinary people throughout the empire. But perhaps Roxelana's most important legacy was proving that intelligence and determination could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. In an age when a woman's fate was typically determined by the circumstances of her birth, she demonstrated that it was possible to write your own story, even if that story required rewriting the rules of an entire empire. Her tomb in Istanbul became a pilgrimage site, not just for Muslims, but for women from throughout the region who saw her as a symbol of what was possible when you refused to accept the limitations that society tried to impose on you. Centuries later, her story would inspire feminists and political activists who found in her example proof that no system of oppression is truly unbreakable. The girl who had started life as a nameless slave had become a symbol of female empowerment that transcended the specific historical circumstances of her rise to power. She had achieved a kind of immortality that no amount of political power could have guaranteed. But immortality, like political success, comes with a price. And Roxelana's price was being forever associated with the decline of the empire she had worked so hard to control. Let's step back and consider what we've just witnessed. The most successful political career in the history of the Ottoman Empire, conducted entirely by someone who officially had no political power at all. Roxelana took a system designed to keep women powerless and used it to become one of the most influential rulers of the 16th century. The fact that we're still talking about her 500 years later suggests that her impact transcended the specific circumstances of her time. But measuring that impact requires grappling with some uncomfortable questions about power, morality, and the price of success in a world that offers people like Roxelana very few good choices. Start with the obvious. Roxelana was responsible, directly or indirectly, for the deaths of multiple people who stood in her way. Prince Mustafa, the most capable of Suleiman's sons, died because she convinced his father that he was a threat. Various other potential rivals disappeared in ways that were probably not coincidental. If we're keeping score in terms of body count, Roxelana's rise to power was built on a foundation of carefully orchestrated violence. On the other hand, Violence was the standard currency of Ottoman politics. The system she was operating within had normalized fratricide, assassination, and elimination of political rivals as routine tools of statecraft. In that context, Roxelana wasn't introducing violence into Ottoman politics, she was just redirecting it in ways that served her interests rather than someone else's. The more interesting question is whether her methods were exceptional, or simply more visible, because she was a woman operating in a male-dominated system. When male rulers eliminate rivals, we call it statecraft. When a female consort does the same thing, we call it manipulation. There's probably some gender bias in how we evaluate Roxelana's tactics compared to those of her male contemporaries. But let's also acknowledge the obvious. Roxelana's success came at a significant cost to the Ottoman Empire. Selim II was genuinely a poor choice for Sultan, and his reign marked the beginning of a long period of Ottoman stagnation and decline. If we're evaluating Roxelana's legacy in terms of what was best for the empire as a whole, it's hard to argue that her actions were beneficial. However, this critique assumes that Roxelana had an obligation to prioritize the empire's interests over her family's survival, and that assumption is problematic for several reasons. First, Roxelana was never a voluntary participant in the Ottoman system. She was enslaved, transported to the capital against her will, and forced to compete for survival in an environment where failure meant death or irrelevance. Expecting her to act as a selfless guardian of imperial interests ignores the fact that she never chose to be part of the empire in the first place. Second, the Ottoman system itself was designed to prevent exactly the kind of rational, merit-based decision-making that might have produced better outcomes. The tradition of fratricide, the isolation of potential heirs, the emphasis on palace intrigue over administrative competence. All of these features made it almost inevitable that succession decisions would be based on political maneuvering rather than qualification for leadership. Roxelana didn't create this dysfunctional system, she just learned to excel within it. If the empire suffered from having an incompetent ruler, that's at least partly the fault of institutions that made competent rulers difficult to identify and select. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Roxelana's story illustrates the impossible position that intelligent, ambitious women found themselves in throughout most of human history. The system offered her no legitimate path to power or influence. She could either accept marginalization and vulnerability, or find illegitimate ways to protect herself and her family. Given those options, it's hard to fault her for choosing survival and success over passive acceptance of an unjust system. The broader historical significance of Roxelana's career lies in what it revealed about the potential for systemic change through individual action. She didn't just succeed within the existing Ottoman system, she fundamentally altered that system in ways that created new possibilities for future generations of women. Before Roxelana, the idea of a sultan's wife having significant political influence was almost unthinkable. After her, it became routine. The sultanate of women that followed her death saw female relatives of the sultan wielding power that would have been impossible without her precedent. Her architectural and charitable works also established new models for how women could exercise public influence. The hospitals, schools, and mosques she funded provided essential services, while demonstrating that women could be effective public administrators and social reformers. Perhaps most importantly, her story became a template for how intelligent, determined individuals could challenge seemingly fixed social hierarchies. Her example inspired generations of women who found themselves trapped in systems that denied them opportunities for advancement or influence. But we should also acknowledge the limitations of celebrating Roxelana's success. Her story is compelling partly because it's exceptional. The vast majority of women in her position never escaped slavery, let alone achieved positions of power. Focusing too much on her individual triumph can obscure the systemic problems that made her situation necessary in the first place. The Ottoman Empire's reliance on slave labor, its treatment of women as property, its normalization of political violence, none of these problems were solved by Roxelana's success. If anything, her ability to work within these systems might have made them seem more acceptable or legitimate than they actually were. Still, there's something undeniably inspiring about a story of someone who refused to accept the limitations that society tried to impose on them. Roxelana's life demonstrates that even the most entrenched systems of oppression contain possibilities for resistance and transformation, if you're smart enough to find them and brave enough to act on them. The teenage girl who walked into Topkapi Palace as a nameless slave died as one of the most powerful women in the world. The system that was designed to crush her was instead reshaped by her intelligence, determination, and refusal to accept defeat. That transformation came with costs for her enemies, for her family, for the empire itself. But it also created possibilities that hadn't existed before, and those possibilities would outlast all the individual tragedies and triumphs of her remarkable life. The story of Roxelana doesn't end with her death in 5058, or even with Selim's succession in 1566. Her influence on the Ottoman Empire, on the role of women in Islamic societies, and on the broader understanding of what political power could look like, continued to reverberate for centuries. Sometimes the most important consequences of a revolutionary life don't become apparent until long after that life has ended. The immediate aftermath of her death demonstrated just how thoroughly she had transformed Ottoman court culture. Within a decade, other women in the imperial family were wielding the kind of political influence that would have been unthinkable before Roxelana's example. The Sultan's mother, sister, and wives began taking active roles in policy decisions, diplomatic negotiations, and administrative appointments. This wasn't just imitation, it was institutionalization. Roxelana had proven that women could be effective political operators, and the Ottoman system began to formally acknowledge and accommodate female political participation in ways that would have horrified earlier generations of court officials. The period from roughly 1570 to 1650 became known as the Sultanate of Women, during which the Ottoman Empire was effectively co-ruled by a series of powerful female relatives of the Sultan. These women commissioned major architectural projects, funded charitable institutions, negotiated with foreign ambassadors, and made policy decisions that affected millions of people throughout the empire. Nurbanu Sultan, the wife of Selim II and mother of Murad III, built on Roxelana's precedent to become perhaps the most powerful woman in Ottoman history. After Roxelana herself, she corresponded directly with European rulers, mediated between different factions in the Ottoman government, and essentially served as a co-ruler during her son's reign. Safiye Sultan, Murad's wife and mother of Mehmed III, continued this tradition, wielding so much influence that European diplomats routinely included gifts for her in their negotiations with the Ottoman court. She was consulted on major policy decisions and had effective veto power over important appointments. But the influence of Roxelana's example extended far beyond the Ottoman court. Her story became known throughout Europe and the broader Islamic world, where it challenged assumptions about women's capabilities and proper roles in society. European visitors to the Ottoman court were often shocked to discover that women played significant roles in imperial governance, and their accounts helped spread awareness of these possibilities to other societies. In the Islamic world more broadly, Roxelana's example provided a powerful counter-narrative to traditional interpretations of women's roles. While Islamic law and custom had always recognized women's rights to own property and engage in business, the idea of women wielding direct political power was much more controversial. Roxelana's success demonstrated that such power could be exercised effectively and legitimately within an Islamic framework. Her charitable and architectural works also established new models for how women could exercise public influence in Islamic societies. The hospitals, schools, and mosques she funded became templates for female philanthropy throughout the region. The Hurrem Sultan complex in Istanbul, which included a mosque, a madrasa, a hospital, and a public kitchen, demonstrated how women could leave lasting legacies through public works. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of Roxelana's career was its effect on European perceptions of Ottoman society and Islamic civilization more generally. At a time when European writers were increasingly portraying the Islamic world as despotic and backward, Roxelana's story provided evidence of social mobility and female empowerment that challenged these stereotypes. European intellectuals began to use Ottoman examples, including Roxelana's story, to criticize their own society's treatment of women. If a former slave could become an empress in the Islamic world, what did that say about European societies that denied basic rights to noble women? This comparative perspective helped fuel early feminist arguments in Europe, and contributed to broader Enlightenment critiques of traditional social hierarchies. Roxelana's story became part of a larger conversation about merit versus birth, individual capability versus social expectations, and the potential for social transformation through personal agency. The architectural legacy of Roxelana and the other women of the Sultanate of Women also had lasting cultural impact. The buildings they commissioned represented some of the finest examples of Ottoman architecture, and their emphasis on charitable and educational institutions helped establish traditions of female philanthropy that continue to this day. Modern Istanbul still bears the marks of Roxelana's influence. The Harem Sultan complex continues to serve the community. Her tomb remains a site of pilgrimage, and the hammam, bathhouse she commissioned, is still in operation after nearly 500 years. These physical monuments ensure that her legacy remains visible and tangible, not just historical. But evaluating Roxelana's long-term influence also requires acknowledging its limitations and contradictions. While she opened new possibilities for female political participation in the Ottoman Empire, these possibilities remained confined to a very small number of women, those lucky enough to be related to the Sultan. The vast majority of Ottoman women saw no improvement in their circumstances as a result of Roxelana's success. Moreover, the Sultanate of Women period, while demonstrating female political capability, also contributed to the empire's gradual decline. The concentration of power in the hands of palace women, combined with the increasing isolation of sultans from direct governance, created new forms of political dysfunction that weakened Ottoman institutions. Some historians argue that Roxelana's precedent actually made the empire's problems worse, by encouraging future generations of palace women to prioritize family interests over imperial needs. The complex succession disputes and court intrigues of the 17th century can be traced at least partly to the political culture that Roxelana helped establish. This tension between individual success and institutional health reflects the broader paradox of revolutionary change within corrupt systems. Roxelana's achievements were remarkable, but they were achieved within a framework that was fundamentally problematic. Her success didn't reform the Ottoman system so much as redirect its existing dysfunctions in new directions. Still, the ripple effects of her extraordinary life continued to expand long after the specific circumstances that created her opportunities had disappeared. Her story became part of the broader human conversation about power, gender, social mobility, and the possibility of individual agency within seemingly fixed systems. And that conversation continues to this day, as people around the world continue to find inspiration in the example of a teenage slave who refused to accept the limitations that society tried to impose on her. 5 centuries after her death, Roxelana has achieved something that even her extraordinary political skills couldn't have guaranteed during her lifetime. She's become a myth. Unlike most myths, her story has been retold, reinterpreted, and reshaped by each generation according to their own needs, biases, and understanding of what her life means. This process of mythologization began almost immediately after her death. Ottoman chroniclers, writing for an audience that included the very people who had been displaced by her rise to power, tended to portray her as a dangerous manipulator who had corrupted the natural order of imperial succession. These accounts emphasized her foreign origins, her use of feminine wiles to influence the Sultan, and the negative consequences of her political maneuvering. European observers, writing for audiences that were often at war with the Ottoman Empire, developed their own version of the Roxelana myth. In their accounts, she became either a tragic figure, a Christian woman corrupted by Islamic decadence, or a villainous schemer whose influence represented everything wrong with Oriental despotism. These narratives served European political and cultural purposes, but they had little to do with the historical Roxelana. The 18th and 19th centuries saw the emergence of more romanticized versions of her story, influenced by European Orientalist fantasies about harem life. In these accounts, Roxelana became a figure of exotic beauty and mysterious feminine power, manipulating the Sultan through sexual enchantment rather than political skill. These versions were often more concerned with titillating European audiences than with historical accuracy. The 20th century brought new interpretations influenced by changing attitudes toward women's roles and colonial relationships. Early feminist historians began to reclaim Roxelana as a pioneering example of female political achievement, emphasizing her intelligence and strategic thinking rather than her physical attributes. Post-colonial scholars, meanwhile, began to critique European sources and develop more nuanced understandings of Ottoman court culture. Modern Turkish historiography has produced yet another version of Roxelana, one that reflects contemporary Turkey's complex relationship with its Ottoman past. In some accounts, she becomes a symbol of the multicultural inclusiveness of the Ottoman Empire, a foreigner who was accepted and elevated within the system. In others, she represents the dangerous influence of non-Turkish elements on pure Ottoman traditions. Contemporary popular culture has added its own layers to the Roxelana myth. Television series, Novels and films have portrayed her as everything from a feminist icon, to a Machiavellian power seeker, to a tragic romantic heroine. The 2011 Turkish television series Muhteşem Yüzyıl, Magnificent Century, sparked international controversy by presenting her as a complex, sympathetic character, whose political maneuvering was motivated by love and self-defense, rather than pure ambition. Each of these interpretations tells us at least as much about the people creating them as it does about the historical Roxelana. The romantic Orientalist versions reflect European fantasies and prejudices about Islamic societies. The feminist reclamations reflect modern concerns about women's political participation. The Turkish nationalist versions reflect contemporary debates about identity and historical legacy. But all of these reinterpretations also point to something genuine and enduring in Roxelana's story that continues to resonate across cultural and temporal boundaries. At its core, her life represents a fundamental human experience, the struggle to maintain agency and dignity within systems designed to deny both. This universality helps explain why her story has been adapted and retold in so many different contexts. Whether you're a 19th century European feminist arguing for women's suffrage, a 20th century anti-colonial activist challenging imperial hierarchies, or a 21st century entrepreneur trying to succeed in a male-dominated industry, there's something in Roxelana's example that speaks to the experience of overcoming systemic disadvantages through intelligence and determination. Modern historical scholarship has tried to strip away these layers of interpretation to understand the real Roxelana, but that project faces significant challenges. The Ottoman court archives contain relatively little personal information about harem life, partly because such details were considered private, and partly because powerful people had reasons to control how their stories were recorded. What we're left with is a historical figure who is simultaneously over-documented and under-documented. We know a great deal about her political activities and their consequences, but very little about her personality, motivations, or inner life. We can trace her influence on Ottoman policy and culture, but we can only speculate about what she actually thought or felt about the extraordinary circumstances of her rise to power. This ambiguity has made Roxelana a kind of historical Rorschach test. People see in her story whatever they need to see to make sense of their own experiences with power, gender, and social mobility. The fact that she can simultaneously be claimed as a feminist icon and criticized as a manipulative schemer suggests that her story contains enough complexity to support multiple valid interpretations. Perhaps the most honest way to understand Roxelana's legacy is to acknowledge that she was probably all of these things: a skilled politician and a product of circumstance, a loving mother and a ruthless competitor, a symbol of possibility and a cautionary tale about the costs of success in corrupt systems. What seems undeniable is that she was an extraordinary individual who found ways to exercise agency and influence within constraints that would have crushed most people. Whether you interpret her methods as admirable or deplorable probably depends on your own values and circumstances, but her effectiveness is hard to dispute. The continuing fascination with her story also reflects broader human curiosity about how individuals navigate between personal desires and systemic constraints. In a world where most people feel limited by circumstances beyond their control, there's something compelling about someone who managed to rewrite the rules of the game entirely. The myth of Roxelana has become larger than the historical person could ever have been, but myths serve important psychological and cultural functions, and the Roxelana myth continues to provide inspiration and insight for people trying to understand what's possible when intelligence meets opportunity, even under the most challenging circumstances. Her story reminds us that systems that seem fixed and unchangeable are actually maintained by human decisions, and can therefore be altered by human action. That's a lesson that transcends the specific historical context of 16th century Ottoman politics. What kind of person survives being enslaved as a teenager and ends up rewriting the succession laws of an empire? The psychological profile implied by Roxelana's career is so extraordinary that it's worth examining what we can learn about human resilience, adaptability, and the will to power from her example. Start with the most obvious trait: an almost supernatural ability to read and manipulate social dynamics. From her first days in the harem, Roxelana demonstrated an intuitive understanding of how power worked in the Ottoman court. She quickly identified who had real influence, who could be useful allies, and who represented threats that needed to be neutralized. This wasn't academic knowledge that she could have learned from books. It was practical intelligence developed through careful observation and probably some very dangerous trial and error. The margin for error in Ottoman court politics was essentially zero, which means Roxelana must have had an almost perfect understanding of human psychology and social dynamics from a very young age. Think about what this implies about her cognitive abilities. She was simultaneously learning a new language, adapting to a completely alien culture, mastering complex social hierarchies, and developing sophisticated political strategies, all while her life literally depended on not making mistakes. That's the kind of multitasking under pressure that would challenge a modern PhD in psychology. The second crucial trait was emotional resilience, that borders on the superhuman. Roxelana experienced traumatic events that would have broken most people: violent displacement from her family and homeland, enslavement, forced religious conversion, constant threat of death or disposal. Instead of being traumatized into submission, she somehow used these experiences as motivation for an unprecedented rise to power. Modern psychology recognizes that some individuals have extraordinary capacity for what researchers call post-traumatic growth, the ability to use negative experiences as catalysts for positive change. But Roxelana's example suggests resilience levels that go far beyond anything documented in contemporary research. There's also the question of her moral flexibility. Roxelana's rise to power required actions that most people would find psychologically difficult or impossible: manipulating a man who loved her into executing his own son, orchestrating the deaths of political rivals, lying convincingly to people who trusted her. She did all of this while maintaining the appearance of being a loving wife and devoted mother. This suggests either sociopathic personality traits or an extraordinary ability to compartmentalize moral concerns in service of strategic goals. The historical record doesn't give us enough information to determine which explanation is more meritorious, but both possibilities are fascinating from a psychological perspective. The compartmentalization theory is particularly interesting because it suggests that Roxelana managed to maintain genuine human relationships and emotions while simultaneously engaging in ruthless political calculation. If true, this represents a level of psychological complexity that challenges conventional understanding of how moral reasoning works. Consider also her long-term strategic thinking. From her earliest days in the harem, Roxelana seems to have been planning moves that wouldn't pay off for years or even decades. She invested in relationships, accumulated favors, and positioned herself for opportunities that might never come. This kind of delayed gratification and strategic patience is rare even among professional politicians, let alone teenage slaves. The psychological research on delayed gratification suggests that the ability to defer immediate rewards for long-term benefits is one of the strongest predictors of success in complex environments. Roxelana's career represents an extreme example of this capability, sustained over multiple decades in an environment where short-term thinking was often the difference between life and death. Her ability to maintain hope and motivation despite overwhelming odds is another psychologically remarkable trait. Most people in her situation would have focused on basic survival rather than long-term advancement. The fact that she continued to believe that dramatic improvement in her circumstances was possible suggests either extraordinary optimism or an unusually strong internal locus of control. There's also the question of her relationship with risk. Roxelana's career involved taking enormous risks that could have resulted in execution not just for herself, but for her children. Yet she continued to escalate her political activities even as the stakes got higher and higher. This suggests either poor risk assessment skills, unlikely given her other demonstrated abilities, or an unusual psychological relationship with danger. Some people are energized rather than paralyzed by high-stakes situations. They perform better under pressure, and actually seek out challenging circumstances that would terrify others. Roxelana's career suggests that she may have been one of these individuals, someone for whom the danger of Ottoman court politics was stimulating rather than debilitating. The psychological literature on high achievers also emphasizes the importance of what researchers call grit, the combination of passion and perseverance for long-term goals. Roxelana's sustained focus on family advancement over multiple decades, despite numerous setbacks and obstacles, represents an almost textbook example of grit in action. But perhaps the most psychologically interesting aspect of Roxelana's career is how she managed to maintain her humanity while operating in an environment that incentivized ruthless calculation. The historical record suggests that she genuinely loved Sultan and her children, maintained friendships with other women in the harem, and engaged in charitable works that seemed to reflect genuine concern for others' welfare. This combination of ruthless political effectiveness with apparent emotional authenticity is psychologically fascinating. Most models of human behavior assume that these traits are incompatible, that you can't simultaneously be a loving, caring person and a calculating, manipulative strategist. Roxelana's example suggests that this assumption might be wrong, or at least incomplete. The implications are unsettling. If someone can be simultaneously loving and lethal, authentic and manipulative, generous and ruthless, then our usual methods for evaluating character and predicting behavior may be inadequate. Roxelana's psychology seems to have been genuinely complex rather than simply good or evil. Understanding how she managed to integrate these apparently contradictory traits might provide insights into human psychology that go far beyond the specific circumstances of Ottoman court politics. Her example suggests that human beings might be capable of much greater psychological complexity than we typically assume. That complexity might be both the key to her extraordinary success and the reason why her story continues to fascinate people centuries after her death. What can a 21st century person learn from a 16th century Ottoman empress? More than you might expect. While the specific circumstances of Roxelana's rise to power are historically unique, the psychological and strategic principles underlying her success offer surprisingly relevant insights for anyone trying to navigate complex social and professional environments. The first lesson is about the power of authenticity in relationships, even when those relationships serve strategic purposes. Roxelana's success with Sultan wasn't built on deception or manipulation in the traditional sense. It was built on offering him something genuine that he couldn't get anywhere else. In a world where everyone was trying to tell him what they thought he wanted to hear, she apparently told him what she actually thought. Modern research on influence and persuasion confirms that authenticity is often more powerful than calculated charm. People, especially successful and intelligent people, are usually skilled at detecting insincerity. The person who can offer genuine insight, honest feedback, and real intellectual engagement often has more influence than someone who is simply trying to please. This doesn't mean being naive or tactless. Roxelana was certainly strategic about when and how she expressed her authentic thoughts, but it does suggest that the most sustainable form of influence is built on providing genuine value rather than empty flattery. The second lesson concerns the importance of developing multiple types of intelligence simultaneously. Roxelana succeeded because she combined emotional intelligence, understanding people's motivations and reactions, social intelligence, navigating complex group dynamics, strategic intelligence, long-term planning and goal achievement, and cultural intelligence, adapting to new environments and customs. In modern contexts, this kind of multidimensional intelligence is increasingly valuable. Whether you're trying to advance in a corporate environment, build a successful startup, or create social change, you need to understand not just the technical aspects of your field, but also the human dynamics that determine how decisions actually get made. The third lesson is about the power of reframing problems and opportunities. Roxelana didn't accept the traditional definition of her situation, powerless slave concubine, but instead identified ways to create value that the existing system hadn't anticipated. She essentially invented a new role, political advisor and intellectual partner, that gave her access to power through unofficial channels. Modern innovators and entrepreneurs use similar strategies, identifying unmet needs or creating new categories of value that existing systems haven't figured out how to classify or regulate. The key is seeing possibilities that others miss because they're trapped by conventional thinking about how things are supposed to work. The fourth lesson concerns the importance of building networks and alliances before you need them. Roxelana spent years cultivating relationships with people throughout the Ottoman court, creating a web of mutual obligations and shared interests that she could activate when necessary. When crises arose, she already had the support structures in place to respond effectively. This kind of proactive relationship building is equally valuable in modern contexts. Whether you're building a career, launching a business, or trying to create social change, your success will depend largely on your ability to mobilize other people's resources, expertise, and influence. But those relationships need to be built during calm periods, not during emergencies. The fifth lesson is about the power of combining short-term tactical flexibility with long-term strategic consistency. Roxelana was constantly adapting her methods based on changing circumstances, but her fundamental goal, securing power and protection for her family, never wavered. This combination of adaptability and persistence allowed her to navigate a highly unpredictable environment while making steady progress toward her objectives. Modern research on goal achievement emphasizes the importance of this balance. People who are too rigid in their methods often fail when circumstances change, but people who are too flexible often lose focus and never achieve significant results. The key is maintaining clarity about your ultimate objectives while remaining open to different paths for achieving them. The sixth lesson concerns the importance of understanding and working within existing systems, even when those systems are fundamentally unfair. Roxelana didn't waste energy trying to completely overturn the Ottoman harem system. Instead, she learned to excel within it while gradually expanding its boundaries. She achieved revolutionary results through evolutionary methods. This approach is often more effective than direct confrontation, especially when you're starting from a position of limited power, rather than attacking systems head-on. Successful change agents often find ways to work within existing frameworks while gradually shifting them in new directions. The seventh lesson is about the psychological importance of believing in your own agency, even in circumstances that seem hopeless. Roxelana's rise to power required maintaining confidence in her ability to influence events, even when rational analysis would have suggested that her situation was impossible to change. Modern psychology has extensively documented the importance of internal locus of control, the belief that your actions can influence outcomes for success in challenging environments. People who maintain this belief tend to persist longer, notice more opportunities, and recover more quickly from setbacks than those who see themselves as victims of circumstance. But perhaps the most important lesson from Roxelana's story is about the complex relationship between personal success and moral responsibility. Her achievements came at a significant cost to other people, and her methods involved actions that most ethical frameworks would condemn. Yet her success also created new possibilities for other women and demonstrated that seemingly fixed social hierarchies could be challenged and changed. This tension reflects a broader challenge that faces anyone trying to create change within imperfect systems. Pure moral consistency often leads to powerlessness, while effective action often requires moral compromises. Roxelana's example doesn't resolve this dilemma, but it illustrates both the potential and the costs of choosing effectiveness over purity. Modern change agents, whether in business, politics, or social movements, face similar trade-offs between moral clarity and practical effectiveness. Roxelana's story suggests that these choices are often more complex than they initially appear, and that judging historical figures, or contemporary ones, requires understanding the full context of their circumstances and alternatives. The girl who walked into Topkapi Palace as a nameless slave offers lessons that transcend the specific historical circumstances of her rise to power. Her story provides a masterclass in strategy, psychology, and the complex art of creating change from positions of apparent powerlessness. As we reach the end of Roxelana's extraordinary story, we're left with questions that extend far beyond the specific circumstances of 16th century Ottoman politics. Her life raises fundamental issues about power, morality, gender, and human potential that remain as relevant today as they were 5 centuries ago. Sometimes the most important stories are those that resist simple answers. The first eternal question is whether Roxelana was a victim or a perpetrator, or somehow both simultaneously. She began her adult life as a victim of one of history's most brutal systems, enslaved, displaced, and forced into a competition where failure meant death or irrelevance. But her response to victimization involved creating new victims, manipulating people who loved her, and orchestrating the death of at least one person who had never harmed her. This complexity challenges our usual categories for understanding moral responsibility. We want our heroes to be unambiguously good, and our villains to be clearly evil. But Roxelana fits neither category. She was simultaneously oppressed and oppressor, victim and victimizer, defending herself and attacking others. Her story suggests that real moral situations are often too complex for simple judgments. Modern discussions about trauma and resilience recognize that people who have experienced severe harm don't always become saints. Sometimes they become predators. The psychological mechanisms that enable survival in extreme circumstances can also enable harmful behavior toward others. Roxelana's story illustrates this uncomfortable truth about human psychology and moral development. The second eternal question concerns the relationship between individual agency and systemic constraints. Roxelana achieved extraordinary success despite facing obstacles that would have crushed most people. But her success also required working within and ultimately reinforcing systems that oppressed countless others. Did her individual triumph represent a victory over unjust systems, Or did it actually legitimize those systems by proving that success was theoretically possible? This question resonates in contemporary discussions about social mobility and inequality. When exceptional individuals overcome systemic disadvantages, their success is often used to argue that those systems aren't really barriers, that anyone can succeed if they just work hard enough. But Roxelana's story suggests that individual success within unjust systems might actually make those systems more stable, by providing hope that keeps potential rebels invested in reform, rather than revolution. The third eternal question is about the relationship between love and power in human relationships. Roxelana's marriage to Sultan appears to have been based on genuine affection and intellectual partnership. But it also served her strategic interests perfectly. Was her love authentic despite being strategically useful? Or was her strategic thinking so sophisticated that she managed to convince herself and him that calculation was actually emotion? This question has implications that extend far beyond historical curiosity. In a world where relationships increasingly involve strategic considerations, career networking, social media optimization, dating app algorithms, the boundary between authentic emotion and strategic calculation is becoming increasingly blurred. Roxelana's example raises uncomfortable questions about whether purely authentic relationships are even possible in contexts where personal advancement depends on social connections. The fourth eternal question concerns the proper relationship between means and ends in moral reasoning. Roxelana achieved results that many would consider positive. She demonstrated female political capability, created opportunities for other women, funded charitable works, and proved that merit could overcome disadvantages of birth. But she achieved these results through methods that most ethical frameworks would condemn: deception, manipulation, and orchestrated violence. Does the positive impact of her achievements justify the harmful methods she used to achieve them? This question has no clear answer, but it reflects broader debates about consequentialist versus deontological ethics that continue to challenge moral philosophers and political theorists. Roxelana's story provides a particularly complex case study because both her methods and her results had such far-reaching consequences. The fifth eternal question is whether exceptional individuals like Roxelana reveal human potential or distort our understanding of what's possible for ordinary people. Her psychological resilience, strategic intelligence, and political skill were clearly extraordinary, probably far beyond what most people could achieve under similar circumstances. Does her example inspire us to reach for our own potential, or does it create unrealistic expectations that actually discourage effort? Contemporary culture often celebrates exceptional individuals in ways that might be psychologically counterproductive for everyone else. If Roxelana's success required capabilities that most people simply don't possess, then using her as a model for normal human aspiration might be both unfair and discouraging. But if her capabilities were latent human potentials that could be developed under the right circumstances, then her example might provide valuable inspiration for personal development. The sixth eternal question concerns the relationship between historical understanding and moral judgment. We can analyze Roxelana's methods and results with historical detachment, but should we also make moral judgments about her choices? And if we do make such judgments, what standards should we use: the moral frameworks of her own time and culture, or our contemporary understanding of ethics and human rights? This question reflects broader challenges in historical interpretation. Every generation reinterprets the past according to its own values and concerns, but that process of reinterpretation can distort our understanding of what actually happened and why. Roxelana's story has been retold so many times, in so many different contexts, that separating historical fact from moral projection has become almost impossible. Perhaps the most important eternal question raised by Roxelana's story is what it means to live with agency and dignity in circumstances that seem designed to prevent both. Her life represents an extreme example of the human capacity to create meaning and exercise influence, even in the most constrained circumstances. But it also illustrates the moral complexity that often accompanies such achievements. Every person faces some version of Roxelana's fundamental challenge: how to maintain your humanity while doing what's necessary to protect yourself and the people you care about in systems that don't necessarily reward humanness. Her story doesn't provide simple answers to that challenge, but it demonstrates both the possibilities and the costs of refusing to accept powerlessness as your permanent condition. The teenage slave who became an empress achieved something that transcends the specific historical circumstances of her rise to power. She proved that individual human beings, even those starting from positions of extreme disadvantage, can find ways to reshape the world around them, whether that reshaping represents progress or tragedy, or somehow both, remains an open question that each generation must answer for itself. And here we are, at the end of one of history's most improbable success stories, a teenage girl from a Ukrainian village that no longer exists, kidnapped by slave raiders and sold into an imperial harem, somehow managed to become one of the most powerful women in human history. She rewrote the laws of succession in one of the world's great empires, established precedents for female political participation that lasted for centuries, and left architectural and charitable legacies that still serve people today, 500 years after her death. If someone pitched Roxelana's story as fiction, editors would reject it for being too unbelievable. Yet, here's what makes her story ultimately so compelling. It wasn't just about one remarkable individual overcoming impossible odds. It was about what becomes possible when intelligence meets opportunity, when desperation fuels creativity, when someone refuses to accept the limitations that society tries to impose on them. Roxelana's rise to power required a perfect storm of circumstances that could never be replicated. She needed to be enslaved at exactly the right age, transported to exactly the right place, selected for exactly the right institution, and introduced to exactly the right man at exactly the right moment in his life. Any one of those factors being different could have meant that we would never have heard her name. But the psychological and strategic principles that enabled her to take advantage of those circumstances are much more broadly applicable. Her ability to read social dynamics, build strategic relationships, maintain long-term focus while adapting to changing circumstances, and find ways to create value within existing systems. These are capabilities that remain relevant in any era and any context. What's perhaps most remarkable about Roxelana's story is how thoroughly she managed to rewrite the rules of the game she was forced to play. The Ottoman harem system was designed to prevent any one woman from accumulating too much power, but she found ways to circumvent those limitations while technically working within the system. The Ottoman succession traditions were designed to prevent the kind of dynastic maneuvering she orchestrated, but she managed to place her son on the throne despite those safeguards. She essentially hacked the operating system of one of history's most sophisticated political institutions, using nothing but intelligence, determination, and an apparently supernatural understanding of human psychology. The costs of her success were real and significant. Prince Mustafa's death robbed the Ottoman Empire of what might have been its most capable ruler, and Selim II's incompetence contributed to the empire's long-term decline. The precedents she established for female political participation, while groundbreaking, also contributed to the court intrigues that would weaken Ottoman institutions in later centuries. But the alternatives might have been worse. If Roxelana had failed, the traditional system would have continued unchanged, offering no opportunities for female advancement, and no demonstration that merit could overcome disadvantages of birth. Her success, however costly, proved that seemingly fixed social hierarchies could be challenged and changed. More broadly, her story provides crucial historical evidence about human potential and the possibilities for social transformation through individual action. In an age when most people's lives were determined entirely by the circumstances of their birth, she demonstrated that exceptional individuals could transcend those limitations through intelligence and strategic action. This doesn't mean that individual effort alone can solve systemic problems. Roxelana's success required specific historical circumstances that most people never encounter, but it does suggest that even the most entrenched systems contain possibilities for change, if you're smart enough to identify them and brave enough to act on them. The psychological profile implied by Roxelana's career, combining extreme resilience with strategic intelligence, emotional authenticity with political calculation, long-term planning with tactical flexibility, represents capabilities that remain valuable in contemporary contexts. While few of us will face circumstances as extreme as hers, the basic challenge of navigating complex social environments while maintaining personal agency is universal. Her example also provides important insights into the relationship between power and morality that remain relevant for anyone in leadership positions. Roxelana's methods were often ethically questionable, but they were employed in service of goals that many would consider positive. Her story illustrates the moral complexity that often accompanies effective action in imperfect systems. Perhaps most importantly, Roxelana's life demonstrates the transformative power of refusing to accept defeat. She could have resigned herself to being a powerless concubine, accepting whatever fate the system had in store for her. Instead, She chose to believe that dramatic improvement in her circumstances was possible, and she was willing to take enormous risks to achieve it. That refusal to accept powerlessness as a permanent condition might be her most important legacy. Throughout history, the most significant social changes have come from individuals who refused to accept existing limitations as final, who insisted on the possibility of transformation even when rational analysis suggested it was impossible. The girl who walked into Topkapi Palace as a nameless slave died as Hurrem Sultan, legal wife of the Ottoman Emperor, mother of a future Sultan, and one of the most influential women in Islamic history. Her tomb in Istanbul remains a site of pilgrimage for people who see in her example proof that extraordinary transformation is possible, even under the most challenging circumstances. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to Roxelana isn't any physical monument, it's the continuing relevance of the questions her life raises about power, gender, morality, and human potential. 5 centuries after her death, we're still trying to understand how she did what she did, whether her methods were justified, and what her example teaches us about the possibilities and costs of refusing to accept the limitations that society tries to impose on us. Her story reminds us that history isn't just about the actions of kings and generals. It's also about the intelligence, determination, and strategic brilliance of people who found ways to exercise influence despite having no official power. She proved that even in the most constrained circumstances, individual human beings can find ways to reshape the world around them. And sometimes, if they're smart enough and determined enough and just a little bit lucky, they can conquer empires. Let that sink in as you drift off to sleep tonight. Sweet dreams. If you found yourself captivated by Roxelana's impossible journey from Ukrainian peasant to Ottoman empress, you know what to do. Because sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the ones that actually happened.